On August 9, 1945, near the end of World War II, the Soviet Union launched an invasion of Japanese-controlled Manchuria and northern Korea. The United States, concerned that the Soviets may well capture the whole Korean peninsula, presented to the Soviet government a hastily prepared plan to divide Korea at the 38th parallel, which the Soviets accepted. Consequently, the Soviet army continued moving south and stopped at the 38th parallel on August 16, 1945. U.S. forces soon arrived in southern Korea and advanced north, reaching the 38th parallel on September 8, 1945. In December 1945, the Allies formed a trusteeship over Korea, a 5-year process aimed at forming a government for Korea's independence. The U.S.-Soviet Joint Commission was tasked with working out the process, but it ultimately failed in its objective mainly because of the emerging Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. Initially, in the southern zone, U.S. authorities wanted to form a political coalition of moderate rightist and leftist elements. But with the failure of the U.S.-Soviet Joint Commission in September 1947, the United States referred the Korean issue to the United Nations. In November 1947, the UN called for general elections to be held throughout Korea. However, the Soviet government objected, stating that the UN had no jurisdiction over the Korean issue. Consequently, in May 1948, elections were held only in the American-controlled southern zone. Following the elections, in July 1948, pro-West Syngman Rhee became President of the Republic of Korea, which was proclaimed on August 15, 1948. Meanwhile, in the northern zone, Soviet authorities initially worked with a broad coalition of nationalists, Marxists, and even Christian politicians. But in October 1945, Kim Il-sung, the Korean resistance leader, became favored by Soviet authorities. On September 9, 1948, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea was proclaimed, with Kim Il-sung as Prime Minister. The two rival states in Korea, each determined to be the sole authority, set the stage for the coming war. In December 1948, the UN declared South Korea as the legitimate authority, a decision rejected by the Soviet Union and North Korea. Soon, Soviet and American forces withdrew from the peninsula. In March 1949, Kim Il-sung asked Soviet leader Joseph Stalin for military assistance for an invasion of South Korea. Stalin refused, as the Soviet government was currently pressed by Cold War events in Europe. But by early 1950, the Cold War had changed dramatically because of the following events. 1. In September 1949, the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb. 2. In October 1949, Mao Zedong and the Chinese Communists won the Chinese Civil War and seized power in China. 3. In 1950, Vietnamese Communists turned the First Indochina War from an anti-colonial war against France into a Cold War conflict. The Soviets were also encouraged by two other developments. 1. The United States did not intervene for the nationalists in the final stages of the Chinese Civil War. And 2. In January 1949, the United States announced that South Korea was not part of the U.S. defensive perimeter in Asia. To Stalin, the United States was resigned to the whole Northeast Asian mainland falling to communism. In April 1950, the Soviet Union approved North Korea's plan to invade South Korea, but subject to two crucial conditions. 1. Soviet forces would not be involved in the fighting, and 2. China must agree to intervene in the war if necessary. In May 1950, Chinese leader Mao Zedong reluctantly agreed to send Chinese forces if North Korea was invaded. North Korea then hastened its invasion plan. With a massive military buildup in 1949 to 1950, North Korea boasted some 200,000 troops, 280 tanks, 200 artillery pieces, and 200 planes. By contrast, South Korea had 100,000 troops, no tanks, only small-caliber artillery pieces, and no fighter planes. The United States, not wanting a Korean conflict, held back from delivering weapons to South Korea, particularly since President Rhee had declared his intention to invade North Korea in order to reunify the peninsula. On June 25, 1950, North Korea launched a full-scale invasion all across the 38th parallel. South Korean forces, lacking heavy artillery and powerful anti-tank weapons, fled, surrendered, or defected en masse. On June 28, 1950, Seoul fell and South Korea was verging on complete collapse. On June 25, 1950, the UN demanded that North Korea withdraw its forces from South Korea. On June 27, 1950, the UN called on member states to provide military assistance to South Korea. Subsequently, during the war, a combined total of some 370,000 foreign troops from 16 UN countries fought on the side of South Korea. Of this number, nearly 90% was provided by the United States. The United States was caught off guard by the invasion, but quickly moved into action. Until then, US President Harry Truman viewed the Cold War as relating only to Europe, but with the North Korean invasion, for the United States, the Cold War had descended upon Asia. On July 7, 1950, the UN merged all member units into the United Nations Command under one commander, World War II veteran General Douglas MacArthur. In early July 1950, the first UN forces arrived and fought delaying battles against the numerically superior North Korean forces. By then, the remaining South Korean army had been pushed to the southern edge of the Korean peninsula and faced the danger of being annihilated or driven to the sea. But by early August 1950, UN forces had established the 140-mile-long defensive Pusan perimeter with large numbers of troops and war materials arriving daily at Pusan. In August to September 1950, UN forces repelled repeated attacks by the North Koreans, which soon experienced supply problems as US planes attacked North Korean road networks, weapons depots, oil refineries, and military facilities. Then on September 15, 1950, 75,000 UN troops in 260 naval vessels made amphibious landings in Incheon. The unexpectedness of the Incheon landings dealt a huge psychological blow to the North Koreans, and whole military units broke down, and tens of thousands of troops fled north or to the mountains, or surrendered en masse. On September 23, 1950, UN forces at the Pusan perimeter advanced and soon linked up with forces from the Incheon landings. Seoul and all pre-war South Korean territory were retaken, with the remaining North Korean units retreating in disarray across the 38th parallel. On October 9, 1950, UN forces crossed the 38th parallel into North Korea with the aim of reunifying the peninsula under South Korean control. On October 19, 1950, Pyongyang fell, and 5 days later, the UN forces launched the Thanksgiving Offensive and rapidly advanced to the China-North Korea border at the Yalu River. But unbeknownst to the UN command, Chinese forces had already secretly deployed in large numbers into North Korea. On October 25, 1950 in Onjong, and again on November 1, 1950 in Unsan, Chinese forces attacked with overwhelming numbers, forcing the UN forces to retreat south of the Changchun River. At this point, the UN command continued to believe that China would not fully intervene in North Korea. On November 24, 1950, UN forces launched the Home by Christmas Offensive, a cautious two-sector advance toward the Yalu River. Starting the following day, in the Battle of Changchun River, the Chinese attacked with 230,000 troops, forcing UN forces to a general retreat from North Korea. On December 15, 1950, UN forces crossed south of the 38th parallel and set up defensive lines north of Seoul. By then, with China entering the war, for the United States, a permanently divided Korea became a real possibility. In the eastern sector of the Home by Christmas Offensive, the Chinese counterattack forced the retreat of UN forces at the Battle of Chosin Reservoir. On December 10 to 24, 1950, UN forces in the eastern sector made a naval evacuation in Hangnam. In late December 1950, Mao Zedong, rejecting the advice of his top military commanders, ordered his forces to cross the 30th parallel with the objective of expelling the UN forces from Korea and reunifying the peninsula under the Communist North. On January 4, 1951, Seoul was captured by Chinese and North Korean forces, marking the third time the city changed hands during the war. UN forces retreated 50 miles south of the 38th parallel. But by then, the Chinese had exceeded their logistical capability and were running low on food and ammunitions, owing to their primitive logistical system where their supplies were carried by thousands of laborers on foot or bicycles from the Yalu River to South Korea. Then from mid-January to mid-March 1951, UN forces launched a series of limited counteroffensives that gradually pushed back the Chinese and North Koreans. On March 15, 1951, UN forces recaptured Seoul, forcing the Chinese to retreat further north. On March 20, 1951, President Truman announced that he was ready to offer peace talks with China and North Korea before allowing UN forces to again advance into North Korea. But in early April 1951, with General MacArthur's approval, UN forces crossed the 38th parallel and advanced 10 miles into North Korea. On April 11, 1951, President Truman relieved General MacArthur of his command. MacArthur had advocated an escalation of the war, including using nuclear weapons against China. But for Truman, the conflict should only be a limited war because of the United States' Europe First Cold War policy, that is, to divert US troops and resources from Europe to Asia might leave Western Europe open to a Soviet invasion. In April and May 1951, Chinese and North Korean forces launched major offensives that initially made progress but were soon stopped by strong UN resistance and relentless US artillery and air counterattacks. In late May to early June 1951, UN forces launched limited offensives from positions north of the 38th parallel. On July 10, 1951, under mediation efforts by the Soviet Union, representatives from the UN, United States, and South Korea on the one hand, and China and North Korea on the other hand, opened armistice talks in Kaesong. The talks soon moved to Panmunjom, which became the permanent site of negotiations. During the 2-year period of negotiations, only limited-scale battles took place, which were mostly initiated by UN forces and were aimed at gaining better strategic and defensive positions. On July 27, 1953, the Korean Armistice Agreement was signed, which ended the fighting. The final front line, rather than the 38th parallel, was agreed as the Armistice Line. 3 days later, both sides withdrew their forces to a distance of 2 kilometers from the Armistice Line, creating a 4-kilometer demilitarized zone between the opposing forces.